3 days left to live. That's all King Alaric has when a small, dirt-covered girl appears in the castle courtyard holding a baby in tattered blankets. Her request is simple, yet devastating. Can you take care of us? In that moment, something breaks inside the dying monarch. A man who commanded armies but never knew love. What could drive a child to approach a king with such a desperate plea? And why does this simple question shatter 40 years of royal indifference? As the castle walls begin to whisper with conspiracy, one thing becomes clear. This encounter was never about charity. It was about secrets buried deep within the kingdom's foundations. Secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. With his final breaths numbered, Alaric faces an impossible choice. Will his last act as king be one of true courage, or will he die as he lived, alone, respected but unloved, having changed nothing? The clock is ticking, the nobles are circling, and a little girl holds the key to his redemption, or his ultimate disgrace. The weight of mortality hung in the air like poison. King Alaric could taste it with each labored breath, metallic and bitter, as he dragged his failing body across the empty courtyard. 3 days. The royal physicians had whispered it with downcast eyes, unable to meet his gaze. 3 days until death claimed him. The knowledge carved hollow spaces beneath his ribs where hope should have lived. Morning fog clung to the ancient stones, shrouding the castle in ghostly silence. Even the birds seemed to sense the approaching end, their songs absent from the battlements where they normally greeted dawn. The king's trembling fingers clutched his walking stick, knuckles white with effort. Each step sent daggers of pain through his joints, but he refused the indignity of being carried. If these were to be his final hours, he would face them standing, however precariously. A peculiar movement near the servants' entrance caught his eye, a flicker of something that didn't belong. The king narrowed his gaze, heart skipping a dangerous beat. A small figure emerged from the shadows, a girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, her hair a tangled mess of copper, face smudged with the grime of poverty. What made his breath catch, however, was the bundle cradled in her thin arms, a baby, wrapped in tattered cloth that might once have been a sack for grain. The girl stood unflinching, meeting the king's eyes with a directness that no courtier would dare. In that moment, something inside him recognized her gaze, the hollow desperation of having nothing left to lose. She took 3 deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between absolute power and absolute vulnerability. The guards, momentarily stunned by her audacity, remained frozen at their posts. "Can you take care of us?" Her voice carried across the courtyard, fragile yet firm, each word precise as though she had rehearsed this moment countless times. The question pierced Alaric more deeply than any assassin's blade, not a plea for bread or coins, but for care, something he had neither received nor given in decades of rule. A poisonous thought invaded his mind. When had anyone last approached him, not for what he could grant, but for who he might be? A violent tremor seized his left hand, forcing him to tighten his grip on the walking stick until the wood nearly splintered. The baby in the girl's arms whimpered, a soft sound that echoed against the stone walls. The king noticed how she instinctively adjusted her hold, tucking the infant closer to her warmth, though she had precious little to share. Her fingernails were rimmed with dirt, her knuckles raw from cold, yet she handled the child with unexpected gentleness. A memory surfaced unbidden, his own mother's hands, now lost to the fog of time, once performing the same protective gesture. "Where are your parents, child?" the king asked, his voice breaking on the final word. He cleared his throat, embarrassed by this betrayal of weakness. "Dead, my lord. Fever took mother last winter. Father never came back from the northern wars." She spoke without self-pity, stating facts as immutable as seasons. "This is my brother. He's got no one but me now." Alaric felt something wet upon his cheek and realized with shock that a tear had escaped his control. How long had it been since he had wept? 20 years? 30? The droplet traced a path through the creases of his face, carrying with it decades of carefully maintained distance. He wiped it away roughly, but not before the girl had seen. Inside the castle, movement stirred, the court awakening. Soon the corridors would fill with nobles and their endless demands, with counselors bearing documents requiring his final approval before the crown passed to his nephew, a young man who had never known hardship. The world of politics and power waited just beyond the courtyard, a realm where children like these were invisible. "Do you know who I am?" the king asked, suddenly needing to hear how she perceived him. "You're the king," she answered simply. "Mother said kings protect people who can't protect themselves." A flicker of doubt crossed her face, as though she'd begun to suspect this was merely another adult lie. The royal physicians had prescribed rest and solitude for his final days. The council had arranged a quiet passing, befitting the dignified end of a long reign. Nothing in their careful plans had accounted for this, a starving child holding a baby, asking the impossible from a dying man. If he helped them, it would create chaos. The nobles would see it as madness, the first sign that his mind was failing alongside his body. His nephew would resent any complication to the carefully orchestrated transition of power. The kingdom itself might suffer if he diverted attention from crucial matters of state to focus on two insignificant lives. If he turned them away, he would die exactly as he had lived, practical, reasonable, and utterly alone. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. The baby began to cry in earnest now, a desperate sound that spoke of hunger too long endured. The girl bounced him gently, whispering words too soft to hear, though her own stomach must have been equally empty. "What is your name?" the king asked, stalling for time while his mind raced through impossible options. "Eliza, my lord," she replied, then touched the baby's forehead. "This is Thomas." Simple names, common names, names that would never appear in royal chronicles or ballads. Yet they suddenly seemed to matter more than all the treaties he had signed. The king opened his mouth to answer, the weight of his decision pressing against his chest like a physical thing. But before he could speak, Eliza stepped closer still and revealed something that changed everything. Words that would shatter the foundations of his carefully ordered world and rewrite the final chapter of his life. The king's heart hammered against his frail ribs as Eliza's words hung in the cold morning air. She knew about the sealed chamber beneath the eastern tower, a place where documents were hidden that could destroy noble families with a single page. Her mother, a scullery maid who had once served in the royal kitchens, had overheard conversations never meant for common ears. Conversations about bloodlines falsified, about land stolen through forged deeds, about assassinations disguised as accidents. Mother said these secrets protect the wrong people, Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft whimpering of the baby. She said only you could make it right. Alaric's mouth went dry. The child spoke of matters that had haunted his conscience for decades, compromises made, eyes averted, justice delayed in the name of stability. How could this ragged girl possess knowledge that his most trusted advisors dared not mention? He studied her face, searching for deception, but found only the terrible honesty of the desperate. "Come," he commanded, his voice sharper than intended. The guard straightened, awaiting instructions. "These children will accompany me to my private chambers. No one is to know of their presence." He fixed the nearest guard with a stare that, despite his weakened state, still carried the weight of absolute authority. "No one. Is that understood?" The guard nodded, though his eyes betrayed his confusion. The king, known for his rigid adherence to protocol, was breaking every rule of court etiquette. Peasant children simply did not enter royal quarters. It wasn't done. Eliza followed the king without hesitation, cradling Thomas against her chest as they entered the shadowy corridors of the castle. The contrast between her mud-caked boots and the polished marble floors created a visual discord that seemed to physically pain the servants they passed. Their eyes widened in shock before quickly lowering in practiced deference. The king felt their stares on his back. Already the whispers would be beginning. His private chambers were warm, a fire perpetually maintained to ease his aching joints. The opulence of the room, tapestries depicting great hunts, furniture carved from wood so rare they came from lands whose names Eliza would never have heard, seemed to shrink the children further. The girl stood in the center of a Turkish carpet worth more than her entire village, yet carried herself with strange dignity. "Sit," the king said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. She hesitated, looking at her dirty clothes, then at the velvet upholstery. Understanding, he nodded. "It doesn't matter. Sit." As the girl settled into the chair, Thomas's cries softened to hiccuping sobs. The heat of the fire had already brought color to the baby's pale cheeks. Alaric rang a small silver bell, and within moments a servant appeared, eyes carefully trained on the floor to hide his curiosity. "Bring food," the king ordered. "Warm broth, soft bread, milk for the infant, and clean clothes, something suitable for—" He paused, realizing he had no idea what clothes would fit children of their age and station. "Use your judgment. Now go." When they were alone again, the king lowered himself into a chair opposite Eliza, the effort costing him more strength than he cared to admit. The girl watched him with unnervingly adult eyes. "Your mother," he began, choosing his words carefully. "What exactly did she tell you about the documents?" "That they're hidden behind the red oak panel," Eliza replied without hesitation. "That they tell the truth about who really owns the western farms and why Lord Blackwell's brother disappeared after the harvest feast 3 summers ago." She stroked Thomas's head absently, her fingers disappearing into his fine hair. "She said Lord Blackwell isn't really a lord at all." The king's breath caught. The girl recited secrets that could trigger civil war if widely known. Her mother must have been more than a simple kitchen maid, perhaps one of the silent army of servants who became invisible to the nobility, moving through rooms while conversations continued as if no one else were present. The bells of the village church echoed through the window, counting out another hour of his dwindling life. Each toll reminded Alaric that time, the one resource he had always commanded in abundance, was now his scarcest possession. 3 days, perhaps less. "Why come to me now?" he asked, leaning forward despite the pain it caused. "Why not approach my nephew after—" He couldn't bring himself to say it. "Mother said you were different before the Queen died." Eliza's bluntness struck like a physical blow. "She said you used to care about justice, that you'd remember at the end." The mention of his wife, dead 22 years this spring, opened a wound the king had thought long scarred over. Memories flooded back. Elizabeth's laugh, her fierce arguments against his more pragmatic decisions, the way she insisted on walking among the people without guards. How quickly he had retreated into formality after losing her. How readily he had accepted the council's increasingly corrupt bargains. Not because he didn't see them for what they were, but because fighting seemed pointless without her fire beside him. The servant returned with a tray, breaking the king's reverie. Alaric watched as Eliza carefully tested the temperature of the milk before offering it to Thomas. She dipped a clean cloth into the warm liquid and let the baby suck it, his tiny hands grasping at the fabric. Only when her brother had taken several mouthfuls did she reach for the broth herself, sipping it slowly as if savoring each spoonful. "You care for him well," the king observed. "He's all I have," she answered simply, her eyes never leaving the baby. The enormity of what she was asking settled over Alaric like a leaden cloak. Protecting these children meant confronting the very power structure he had allowed to fester. It meant using his final days not in peaceful reflection, but in a bitter struggle against men who had decades of life ahead of them. Men who would inherit his kingdom and reshape his legacy at will. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes as she looked up from her brother. "Mother believed in you," she said, her voice breaking. "She said only the king could protect us." The king closed his eyes, divided between dismissing everything as the desperate fabrication of a hungry child or accepting that fate had delivered him one final chance at redemption. He might have only 3 days, but perhaps they could still matter. Perhaps they could still change something. Before he could respond, the chamber door burst open without announcement. The king's head counselor, Lord Edgar, stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the corridor torches. His eyes moved from the king to the children, then back again, his expression shifting from surprise to something darker. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice silky with practiced concern. "What is the meaning of this unusual audience?" The king recognized the dangerous gleam in Edgar's eye. This man had been his right hand for 15 years, orchestrating many of the very compromises Eliza's mother had apparently witnessed. If what the girl said was true, Edgar had the most to lose. Alaric straightened in his chair, summoning the regal posture that had become second nature over 4 decades on the throne. His next words would either condemn these children or set in motion his final, and perhaps only meaningful, act as king. "These children are under my protection," King Alaric declared, each word measured and final. His voice, though weakened by illness, carried the authority of decades on the throne. "They will remain here as my guests." Lord Edgar's lips parted slightly, the only visible sign of his astonishment. The counselor recovered quickly, his features settling into a mask of solicitous concern. "Your Majesty, in your condition, surely the burden of entertaining street urchins is mine to bear," Alaric interrupted, fixing Edgar with a stare that had once made foreign ambassadors tremble. "I don't recall asking for your counsel on this matter." A muscle twitched in Edgar's jaw. He bowed, perfectly correct in form, yet somehow conveying profound disapproval. "As you wish. However, the Council awaits your signature on the harvest taxation amendments. Matters of state cannot wait, even for charity." "They will wait until I am ready," the king replied. "Now leave us." After Edgar withdrew, closing the door with deliberate softness, Alaric slumped back in his chair. The brief confrontation had drained what little strength he possessed. A deep, rattling cough seized him, and he pressed a handkerchief to his mouth. When he pulled it away, flecks of blood stained the fine linen, evidence that the physician's timeline might be optimistic. Eliza watched him with those disconcertingly perceptive eyes. "He's one of the bad ones," she observed quietly. "Mother said he visits Lord Blackwell's house at night, carrying papers in a red leather case." The king nodded, unsurprised. "Edgar has served me for 15 years. I've trusted him with matters few others know." He paused, studying the girl's face. But trust and virtue are not always companions. A servant arrived with clothes for the children, simple but clean garments that must have belonged to the castle staff's own children. Alaric directed the woman to prepare the small adjoining chamber where visiting royal physicians occasionally stayed. Her eyes widened at the instruction, but she knew better than to question the king. "You and your brother will sleep there," he told Eliza. "No one will disturb you without my permission." The girl looked torn between relief and suspicion. "Why are you helping us?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple yet cutting to the heart of everything. Why indeed? Was it guilt? A desperate grab for redemption before facing whatever judgment awaited him? Or something more primal, the ache of a man who had ruled a kingdom but never raised a child? "Because I can," he finally answered. "Because I should have helped many others before you." This simple admission seemed to satisfy Eliza more than any grand declaration might have. She nodded solemnly, then tended to Thomas, who had fallen asleep with milk still wet on his tiny lips. By midday, the news had spread throughout the castle like wildfire in a drought-stricken forest. Servants whispered in corners, their voices hushed but urgent. Guards exchanged significant glances as they changed shifts. Even the castle cats seemed to prowl with greater purpose, sensing the disruption in the carefully ordered hierarchy. "The king has taken in beggars," the whispers went. "Street rats, sleeping in chambers fit for visiting royalty." Some found it a touching tale, the dying monarch showing compassion in his final days. Others saw dangerous madness, the first sign that the king's mind had begun to fail along with his body. Most concerning to Alaric were the reactions of the nobility, who saw it as a direct challenge to the natural order they had spent generations maintaining. Lord Edgar had wasted no time. By afternoon, 3 of the king's most influential counselors had requested private audiences, each denied by Alaric's personal guard, now standing with renewed vigilance outside his chambers. The message was clear. The king had chosen isolation with these children over the company of his lifelong advisors. Alaric sat by the window, watching the castle grounds below as the day's activities continued, servants hurrying between buildings, guards patrolling the walls, merchants delivering goods through the eastern gate. How strange that this world would continue after he was gone, these patterns repeating without his witness or approval. "Your Majesty?" Eliza's voice drew him from his thoughts. She had changed into the clean clothes, and with the grime washed from her face, she looked even younger. Thomas slept peacefully in the adjoining room, his tiny chest rising and falling beneath borrowed blankets. "Yes, child. I'm afraid," she admitted, twisting her fingers together. "The servants look at me like I've stolen something." And the tall man with the dark beard, he followed me when I went to use the privy. Alaric frowned. Lord Barrister, Edgar's creature. He would need to be more careful. These children weren't merely unwelcome. They were now perceived as threats. "You were brave to come here, Eliza. Braver still to speak truths many adults fear to whisper." She shrugged, a heartbreakingly adult gesture from such small shoulders. "Mother said the truth is all poor folk have that can't be taken away." A pause. "Sometimes they kill you for it, though." The king felt something twist inside him. Pain, but of a different sort than the disease consuming his body. This child had seen too much, understood too well the cruelty of the world he presided over. What kind of ruler left children with such knowledge and no protection? A knock at the door interrupted his self-recrimination. The captain of his personal guard entered, expression grave. "Your Majesty, there's a situation developing. A crowd has gathered in the lower courtyard, common folk from the city. They're asking about the children. Word has spread." Alaric nodded slowly. "What is their mood?" "Mixed, sire. Some appear concerned. Others—" The captain hesitated. "Others seem heartened. They're saying it's a sign that the king remembers the common people in his final hours." How quickly the story had traveled beyond castle walls. Alaric had underestimated both the speed of gossip and its power. What began as a simple act of compassion, or perhaps selfish redemption, was transforming into something with political dimensions. "Double the guard," the king ordered, not to threaten the crowd but to ensure no one interferes with these children's safety. After the captain left, Alaric turned back to Eliza. "We've started something neither of us fully understands," he admitted. "But I give you my word, as long as I draw breath, you and Thomas will remain under my protection." The simple promise felt more binding than any treaty he had ever signed with foreign powers. It was a commitment not to abstract principles or distant peoples, but to two specific lives now intertwined with his final days. That evening, as Eliza and Thomas slept in the adjoining chamber, Alaric received a message he could not refuse. His nephew, Prince Darian, the future king, requested an immediate audience. As heir to the throne, even the dying king could not deny him entry. The young man entered with poorly concealed agitation, his handsome features taut with concern. At 27 years old, Darian had been groomed for kingship since birth, educated in statecraft, warfare, and diplomacy. Yet for all his preparation, he had never fully grasped the deeper currents of power that flowed beneath the visible structures of governance. "Uncle," he began, formality barely masking his frustration, "the council is in an uproar. Lord Edgar says you've secluded yourself with street children rather than attending to final matters of state. The nobles are questioning your clarity of mind." Alaric studied his sister's son, searching for signs of the genuine concern he'd once seen in the boy. Instead, he found only the practiced worry of a politician sensing disruption to carefully laid plans. "Do you question my clarity as well, nephew?" the king asked softly. Darian hesitated, caught between honesty and protocol. "I question the wisdom of creating such controversy in your final days," he finally replied. "The transition must be smooth. The people need stability, not spectacle." The word spectacle hung in the air between them, revealing more than Darian perhaps intended. The prince didn't see two vulnerable children. He saw an inconvenient drama threatening his seamless ascension to power. "Come closer," Alaric commanded, his voice suddenly stronger. When his nephew reluctantly approached, the king grasped his wrist with surprising strength. "Listen carefully, Darian. In 3 days, perhaps less, this crown passes to you. But until that moment, I am still your king, and I have made my decision regarding these children." Something flickered in the prince's eyes. Fear, respect, or perhaps a dawning realization that his uncle's apparent weakness concealed an iron will still capable of shaping events beyond his death. "The girl knows things." Alaric continued, lowering his voice. Things about Lord Edgar and others on the council. Things that, if I had been a better king, I would have discovered long ago. Darian's expression shifted, calculation replacing indignation. What sort of things? Before the king could answer, a muffled cry came from the adjoining chamber. Thomas waking hungry in the night. The moment shattered, but the king had seen enough. His nephew's interest had been piqued not by concern for justice, but by potential leverage over the council. That will be a conversation for another time, Alaric said, releasing Darian's wrist. For now, know this. My protection of these children is neither madness nor sentimentality. It is perhaps the first truly kingly act I've performed in years. By dawn of the second day, the castle hummed with an energy not felt in decades. Servants rushed through corridors, their whispers creating a constant undercurrent of speculation. Stable boys and kitchen maids traded theories about the mysterious children now housed in the royal chambers. Guards stood straighter at their posts, uncertain whether this strange development required greater vigilance or represented the beginning of the end of order. Beyond the castle walls, the story had taken on a life of its own. In taverns and market squares, on church steps and at communal wells, the common folk spoke of little else. The dying king had taken in 2 orphans from the streets, a girl and her infant brother. Some claimed the children were angels in disguise, sent to test the king's heart before his final judgment. Others insisted they were clever beggars who had manipulated a failing mind. The most dangerous rumor, spreading rapidly through the poorest quarters, suggested something else entirely, that the king in his final days had remembered the suffering of his lowest subjects. They say he fed them with his own hands, a washerwoman told her neighbors as they beat linens against the stones of the river. My cousin's boy, who delivers firewood to the castle, swears he saw the girl sleeping in a bed meant for visiting nobles. It's a sign, declared an elderly cobbler, his gnarled fingers pausing over his work. The king sees what we've always known, that the nobles feast while children starve in the shadows of their manors. The idea took hold like a seedling finding purchase in cracked stone, tentative at first, then increasingly stubborn. If the king could see the worth in street children, perhaps the gap between peasant and noble wasn't as divinely ordained as they had been taught to believe. Inside the castle, Eliza sat cross-legged on a cushioned window seat, watching the activity in the courtyard below, while Thomas slept nearby in a cradle hastily constructed by the royal carpenter. Her copper hair had been washed and braided by one of the king's attendants, a woman who had initially approached the task with thinly veiled disgust, only to be disarmed by the girl's quiet dignity. King Alaric observed her from his chair, struck by how quickly she had adapted to her surroundings. There was no gawking at the luxuries around her, no childish excitement at the fine foods brought at regular intervals. Instead, she displayed a watchful patience that seemed far beyond her years. "People are talking about us," she said without turning from the window. "Down there. They're pointing at your window." "Yes," the king acknowledged. "Stories spread quickly." "Are you afraid?" she asked, finally looking at him. "The men with the fancy clothes, they look at you differently now." Alaric considered the question. Fear had been a distant companion for so long. A king could not rule effectively if paralyzed by it. Yet now, with his body failing and these children under his protection, he felt its cold fingers more acutely than ever. "Not for myself," he answered truthfully. "My fears now are for others." A discreet knock interrupted them. The captain of the guard entered, his face taut with tension. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. There's a delegation at the main gate, common folk from the city. They're asking to see the children, to bring them gifts." The king raised an eyebrow. "Gifts?" "Food, mainly. Homespun blankets. A wooden toy or two." The captain shifted uncomfortably. "It's irregular, sire. Lord Edgar suggests dispersing them immediately. And yet you came to me first," Alaric noted. "Why?" The captain hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "These are not troublemakers, Your Majesty. They're ordinary subjects. Bakers, blacksmiths, seamstresses. People who rarely approach the castle except on tax day." A pause. "They seem genuinely moved." The king closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. His decision would send ripples far beyond the castle walls. The nobles would see any acknowledgement of this delegation as further evidence of his mental decline, yet to reject a spontaneous gesture of kindness from his subjects seemed contrary to everything these past 24 hours had awakened in him. "Allow 3 representatives to enter," he finally said. "They may present their gifts to the steward, who will deliver them here after proper inspection." The captain bowed and withdrew. Eliza had listened to the exchange with intense focus, her expression unreadable. "Why would they bring gifts?" she asked. "They don't know us." "Sometimes people need symbols," Alaric explained, his voice gentle. "A story they can hold on to when their own lives feel beyond their control." She considered this, then nodded as if it confirmed something she had already suspected. "Like the story of the saint who gave away his cloak." "Something like that, yes." The gifts arrived an hour later, humble offerings that nonetheless represented significant sacrifices from people who had little to spare. A loaf of sweet bread still warm from the oven, a tiny wooden horse lovingly whittled and sanded smooth, a blanket pieced together from scraps of cloth, each stitch speaking of hours of labor by candlelight. Eliza received each item with solemn thanks, instructing the steward to relay her gratitude to the givers. When she unfolded the blanket to wrap around Thomas, the king noticed her fingers tremble slightly, the first crack in her composure he had witnessed. "It's soft," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "So soft." The moment was interrupted by raised voices outside the door. Lord Edgar's distinctive tones cut through, demanding entry despite the guards' protestations. Before the king could intervene, the door burst open, and Edgar strode in, followed by 2 other council members, Lord Barrister and Lady Hawthorne, the only woman on the royal council. "Your Majesty," Edgar began without preamble, "this situation has become untenable. The castle is surrounded by peasants bearing gifts. The nobles are questioning your judgment, and now we hear Prince Darien was summoned for a private audience regarding these children." He spat the last word as if it tasted foul. Lady Hawthorne stepped forward, her approach more measured. "Sire, we mean no disrespect. Your compassion is admirable. But surely these children would be better served in an orphanage with proper caretakers. Your strength must be reserved for matters of state, especially now." Alaric regarded them silently, noting how Eliza had shrunk back toward Thomas's cradle, one hand protectively resting on its edge. The contrast between the richly dressed council members and the formerly ragged child could not have been starker. And yet in this moment the king found more nobility in her protective stance than in all the carefully constructed arguments of his advisors. "These children remain under my protection," he stated, his tone brooking no argument. "If you truly wish to serve me in my final days, you will ensure their safety and comfort without further question." Lord Barrister's face darkened. "And after, Your Majesty, when you are gone, what becomes of them then?" The question hung in the air, exposing the vulnerability at the heart of the king's gesture. His protection extended only as far as his breath, a commodity now measured in hours rather than years. "That will be addressed before my passing," Alaric replied, though in truth, he had not yet determined how to secure the children's future beyond his death. Prince Darien had shown more interest in political leverage than in honoring his uncle's wishes. Edgar stepped closer, lowering his voice to a confidential murmur. "Your Majesty, there are rumors circulating, dangerous rumors. The girl is said to possess information that could destabilize the very foundations of the kingdom if it fell into the wrong hands." The king met his counselor's gaze unflinchingly. "And whose hands would those be, Lord Edgar? Those who seek truth or those who have profited from its absence?" A flash of alarm crossed Edgar's features before he could master it. The king had confirmed his worst fear, that Eliza's presence represented not merely an old man's sentimentality, but a deliberate challenge to the corrupt systems that had flourished under his negligent rule. "Truth is a luxury few kingdoms can afford, sire," Lady Hawthorne interjected smoothly. "Stability requires compromises." "So I have been told for 4 decades, Alaric replied. "Perhaps it is time to test that theory." The council members exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years working in concert to maintain their influence. Without another word, they withdrew, their rigid postures betraying the tension their polite bows attempted to disguise. When they had gone, Eliza emerged from beside the cradle, her eyes wide with understanding beyond her years. "They're scared of me," she said, not a question, but a realization. The king nodded slowly. "They fear what you represent, and what you know." "Will they try to hurt us?" The question was asked matter-of-factly, without the tremor that might be expected from a child. Alaric recognized in her calm acceptance the wisdom of those who had grown up expecting betrayal rather than protection from those in power. "Not while I live," he promised, though they both understood how limited that assurance had become. As if to emphasize the point, a spasm of coughing seized him, more violent than before. When it passed, leaving him weak and gasping, he found Eliza at his side, offering a cup of water with steady hands. "Rest now," she said, in a voice that might have belonged to someone far older. "Save your strength. You'll need it tomorrow." Dawn broke on what the physicians had predicted would be the king's final day. Pale golden light filtered through the leaded glass windows, casting long shadows across the chamber floor. Alaric had slept poorly, his dreams haunted by faces from his past. Elizabeth with her knowing smile, counselors whose advice he had followed despite his misgivings, peasants whose names he had never bothered to learn despite their decades of labor for the crown. He awoke to find Eliza already dressed and alert, sitting in a chair pulled close to his bedside. Her steady gaze reminded him of a night nurse he'd had as a child. Watchful, patient, missing nothing. "You should have woken me," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You needed sleep," she replied simply, offering a cup of water with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to caring for others. "The baby woke twice. I took him to the other room so you wouldn't hear." Thomas lay in his makeshift cradle, tiny fists occasionally punching the air as he dreamed infant dreams. The sight stirred something in Alaric's chest, a longing for the family he had never created, the legacy of flesh and blood he had sacrificed to the demands of the crown. A discreet knock announced the arrival of the royal physician, a gray-bearded man who had attended the king for over 15 years. His examination was brief and conducted in silence, but his expression confirmed what Alaric already felt in his failing body. Time had become a luxury he no longer possessed. "The council has requested an urgent meeting, Your Majesty," the physician finally said, packing away his instruments. "They await your convenience in the small council chamber." The formal phrasing barely disguised the underlying message. The council had decided the king's isolation with the children had gone on long enough. They would no longer be denied access, even if it meant confronting a dying man. "Tell them I will attend within the hour," Alaric replied, surprising both the physician and himself with the decision. He had intended to spend his final hours with Eliza and Thomas, shielded from the machinations of court politics. But perhaps there was one last stand to be made, one final chance to secure the children's future. After the physician departed, Eliza helped the king dress with unexpected skill, her small hands working efficiently to fasten the elaborate closures of his royal garments. She said nothing as she assisted him, but her eyes betrayed her understanding. This was more than a meeting. It was a confrontation. "I want you to remain here with Thomas," Alaric instructed, settling a heavy ceremonial ring onto his finger. "Keep the door barred, open only for my personal guard." She nodded, her gaze direct and unafraid. "Will you tell them about the secret papers?" The question gave him pause. The documents Eliza's mother had witnessed being hidden, proof of noble corruption, falsified bloodlines, and crimes concealed, could indeed provide leverage. But using them meant engaging in the same political gamesmanship he now regretted defining his reign. "I will do what is necessary to protect you both," he finally answered. "Beyond that, I make no promises." The effort of walking to the council chamber nearly depleted what little strength Alaric had mustered. His personal guard formed a protective phalanx around him, their presence both support and statement. The king might be dying, but his authority remained intact. Each labored step sent pain shooting through his joints, each breath burned in lungs increasingly unable to fulfill their function, yet he refused the offered sedan chair. He would face the council on his feet, not carried like an invalid. The small council chamber fell silent as Alaric entered. 8 faces turned toward him, the highest nobles in the land, men and women who controlled vast territories and commanded thousands. Lord Edgar sat at the far end, his position a subtle challenge to the king's authority. Beside him, Prince Darien looked uncomfortable, caught between deference to his uncle and alignment with the power that would soon support his reign. "Your Majesty honors us," Lady Hawthorne said, rising in a rustle of expensive silk. The others followed suit, though several exchanged glances that suggested they had not expected the king to actually appear. "I understand there are concerns to be addressed," Alaric stated, lowering himself carefully into the ornate chair at the head of the table. He did not waste energy on pleasantries or pretense. "Speak freely." Lord Edgar cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, we have served you loyally for many years. It pains us to see your final hours disturbed by irregular circumstances." He paused, selecting his words with practiced diplomacy. "The children you have taken in, while your compassion is commendable, have become the center of troubling developments." "What developments?" Alaric asked, his tone deceptively mild. Lord Barrister leaned forward, his heavy rings clinking against the polished table. "The commoners, sire. They've begun gathering in larger numbers, not just at the castle gates now, but in the main square and before the homes of several council members. They speak of the king's orphans as if they were some kind of symbol." "A symbol of what?" Alaric pressed, though he already knew the answer. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. It was Lady Hawthorne who finally voiced what none of the men seemed willing to articulate. "Of change, Your Majesty. The rabble always look for signs that the natural order might be disrupted. A king taking peasant children into the royal chambers." She spread her hands in a gesture that managed to be both elegant and dismissive. "It feeds dangerous ideas." Prince Darien shifted in his seat. "Uncle, as your heir, I must consider the stability of the transition. These children, whatever your personal attachment, cannot remain in the castle after—" He faltered. "After your passing. The precedent would be untenable." Alaric studied his nephew's face, searching for some trace of the curious, compassionate boy he had once been. He found instead a young man, already halfway to becoming the kind of ruler Alaric himself had been. Pragmatic, distant, more concerned with systems than with individual lives. "They will remain," the king declared, his voice suddenly stronger. "The girl and her brother will be granted rooms in the East Wing, an annual stipend from the royal treasury, and the protection of the crown." He let his gaze travel around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "This is not a request. It is my royal decree." The council erupted in protests, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of objections. Lord Edgar's face had flushed a dangerous red, while Lady Hawthorne's features froze in aristocratic horror. Only Prince Darien remained silent, his expression calculating as he observed the unprecedented rebellion against his uncle's will. Alaric allowed the outburst to continue for several moments before raising a hand. Decades of command gave the simple gesture enough power to silence even the most indignant voices. "I understand your concerns," he said, surprising them with his conciliatory tone. "Change is indeed frightening, especially for those who have benefited most from things remaining as they are." The subtle rebuke was not lost on anyone present. Several council members glanced away, unable to meet the king's penetrating gaze. "However," Alaric continued, "my decision regarding these children is final. It will be recorded today and sealed with my royal signet. Any attempt to reverse it after my passing will be recognized as direct defiance of the crown's authority." He turned specifically to Prince Darien. "A questionable beginning to a new reign, wouldn't you agree, nephew?" The young prince's jaw tightened, but he offered no response. The political calculation was visible in his eyes, weighing the cost of honoring his uncle's peculiar final wish against the potential backlash from the nobility whose support he would need. Lord Edgar, seeing his influence over the future king potentially slipping, played his final card. "Your Majesty, there is another matter we must address. The girl, Eliza, has been making claims, dangerous claims about certain members of this council, accusations that, if taken seriously, could undermine the very foundations of governance. What sort of claims? Alaric asked, though he already knew. Fantastical stories, Edgar replied dismissively. Tales of secret documents, hidden chambers, conspiracies among the nobility. The imaginings of a street child seeking to secure her position through lies. The king's lips curved in a cold smile. And if they were not lies, Lord Edgar, if such documents did exist, what then? A heavy silence fell over the chamber. The question hung in the air like the blade of an executioner's axe. Poised, inevitable, fatal. Edgar's face had gone from red to ashen in the span of seconds. Such documents would, of course, need to be thoroughly examined. Lady Hawthorne interjected smoothly. The credibility of sources assessed, contexts considered. They would need to be buried, Alaric interrupted, his voice soft but cutting. Just as the truth has been buried throughout my reign. With my tacit permission, if not my explicit blessing. He looked around the table once more, taking in the faces of those who had helped shape his legacy, a legacy he now saw with painful clarity. I allowed this. My greatest failure was not what I did, but what I permitted others to do while I looked away. The admission seemed to physically alter the atmosphere in the room. None had expected this dying confession, this final acknowledgement of complicity from a king they had always been able to manage through appeals to practicality and tradition. The king's return to his chambers was interrupted by the captain of the guard, who approached with unusual urgency, his armor clanking softly as he bowed. Your Majesty, the situation at the gates has evolved, he reported, choosing his words carefully. The crowd has grown. They're not just bringing gifts now, they're demanding to see you. Alaric leaned heavily on his walking stick, his confrontation with the council having drained what little vitality remained in his failing body. How many? Hundreds, sire. Market vendors, blacksmiths, tanners, bakers, ordinary folk. They've brought their families. The captain hesitated. They're calling the children the king's chosen ones. There are rumors spreading that you intend to change things before you pass. A spasm of pain crossed the king's face, though whether from his illness or the weight of unintended consequences, even he couldn't be sure. What do they expect me to do? I don't know, Your Majesty. But they're growing more insistent. Lord Edgar has ordered additional guards to the walls, but... The captain lowered his voice. Some of my men have family in that crowd. They're uncertain where their loyalty should lie if orders come to disperse them forcefully. Alaric closed his eyes briefly. The simple act of compassion toward two orphaned children had ignited something he never intended. A spark of hope among people who had lived generations without it. Hope, he reflected bitterly, was perhaps the cruelest gift to offer when he had no power to ensure its fulfillment beyond his imminent death. I will address them, he decided, surprising both the captain and himself. Sire, in your condition. Arrange it, I will speak from the north balcony. It overlooks the main courtyard, does it not? It does, Your Majesty, but the physicians have advised against any further exertion. Alaric fixed the man with a stare that, despite his weakened state, still carried the full weight of royal authority. I have less than a day left on this earth, Captain. The physician's concerns are noted and irrelevant. Upon returning to his chambers, Alaric found Eliza sitting by the window, her face pressed against the glass as she observed the growing crowd below. Thomas slept peacefully in his cradle, oblivious to the movement his presence in the castle had helped create. They're singing, the girl said without turning. I've never heard so many people singing together. The king moved to stand beside her, his breath fogging the glass as he looked down. Indeed, a hymn had risen from the assembled masses, not a religious song, but an old folk melody about a just king from centuries past. The irony was not lost on Alaric. I must speak to them, he told Eliza. They've formed expectations that cannot be fulfilled. She turned to him then, her eyes reflecting wisdom far beyond her years. Because you're dying. Yes. And the prince won't protect us when you're gone. It wasn't a question, but Alaric answered anyway. He might. If it serves his interests. The king moved to his writing desk, lowering himself carefully into the chair. But I won't leave your fate to chance or political calculation. With trembling hands, he began to write, his pen scratching against parchment with increasing urgency. Eliza watched silently, understanding instinctively that this moment should not be interrupted with questions. By midday, the crowd had grown so large that it spilled from the main courtyard into the surrounding streets. The sound of their collective voice, sometimes singing, sometimes chanting, the king's children, echoed off the stone walls of the castle like rolling thunder. Lord Edgar arrived uninvited, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. "Your Majesty, this has gone too far. The rabble is becoming dangerously emboldened. I've ordered archers to the walls as a precaution." "Countermand that order immediately," Alaric commanded, rising from his desk with effort. "Any show of force will be seen as provocation. With respect, sire, we cannot allow this mob to dictate terms to the crown." "They're not a mob, Lord Edgar. They're my subjects, the people I swore to protect when I took the throne 4 decades ago." The king sealed the document he had been writing with red wax, pressing his signet ring into it with deliberate force. "A vow I have too often failed to honor." Edgar's gaze fixed on the sealed document. "What is that?" "Insurance," Alaric replied simply. He turned to Eliza, who had remained a silent witness to the exchange. "It's time. Will you accompany me to the balcony?" The girl nodded solemnly, moving to lift Thomas from his cradle. The baby stirred but didn't wake, nestling against his sister's shoulder with complete trust. "This is madness," Edgar protested, his composure finally breaking. "You cannot present these gutter rats to the public as if they were of royal blood." "I present them as what they are," Alaric replied, moving toward the door with slow but determined steps. "Children worthy of protection, no more or less than any child born in my kingdom, regardless of station." The corridor outside was lined with guards, their expressions a mix of confusion and anticipation. Word of the king's intended address had spread throughout the castle, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Nobles and servants alike pressed against walls and into alcoves, watching as the strange procession made its way toward the north wing. The dying king, 2 ragged children, and a visibly agitated Lord Edgar. Prince Darian intercepted them at the entrance to the royal gallery, his handsome face set in lines of concern. "Uncle, reconsider this. The council fears you'll make promises to the commoners that cannot be kept after your passing. It will destabilize the transition." "The transition," Alaric repeated, pausing to catch his breath. "Always the transition, as if the peaceful transfer of power matters more than what that power is used for." He fixed his nephew with a penetrating stare. "Is that what kingship means to you, Darian? The smooth maintenance of systems that benefit the few at the expense of the many?" The prince had no immediate answer, his political instincts failing him in the face of such direct moral challenge. The north balcony, when they reached it, offered a panoramic view of the scene below. The courtyard had become a sea of humanity. Farmers still with soil beneath their fingernails, tradespeople in their work clothes, mothers with children hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. They fell silent at the appearance of the king, a hush spreading outward from the castle walls like ripples in a pond. Alaric stepped forward, his frail figure silhouetted against the stone archway. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, many of whom had not seen their monarch in years, and certainly not in such a diminished state. The king, who had once stood tall and imposing on this same balcony to announce victories and decrees, now leaned heavily on his walking stick, his shoulders bent under the weight of illness and regret. "My people," he began, his voice weaker than he would have liked but carrying nonetheless in the perfect silence that had fallen. "You have come seeking answers about these children." He gestured to Eliza, who stood slightly behind him, Thomas cradled protectively in her arms. "They are not of royal blood. They claim no noble lineage. They are children of this kingdom, orphaned, hungry, forgotten." He paused, gathering strength for what would come next. "Until now." A murmur swept through the crowd, growing in volume as speculation spread from person to person. "I have failed you," Alaric continued, silencing the whispers with his unexpected confession. "For 4 decades I have ruled from behind these walls, concerning myself with treaties and trade agreements while forgetting the faces of those who work the land, build the houses, bake the bread that sustains us all. Lord Edgar stepped forward, his hand reaching for the king's arm in a desperate attempt to halt what he clearly saw as a dangerous address. Alaric shook him off with surprising strength, his eyes never leaving the upturned faces of his subjects. These children came to me in my final hours with nothing but need and truth. Their courage shamed me. Their dignity reminded me of obligations I had forgotten. His voice grew stronger, fueled by the conviction of his words. I cannot undo the neglect of 40 years in a single day, but I can ensure that these 2 lives at least will not be abandoned again. He held up the sealed document he had prepared. By royal decree, these children are now under the permanent protection of the crown. They will be provided for, educated, and treated with the dignity every child in this kingdom deserves. The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound washing over the balcony like a physical force. Eliza's eyes widened at the response, her small body tensing as if unsure whether to retreat from or lean into this unexpected support. This is not charity, Alaric continued when the noise subsided enough for him to be heard. It is the barest beginning of justice, a recognition that the crown's duty extends to all, not merely to those born to privilege. He turned slightly, fixing his gaze on Prince Darian, who stood frozen in the doorway behind them. My heir will honor this decree, he stated, his voice carrying the full weight of royal command. As will the council, who serve not their own interests, but those of the kingdom and all its people. The implicit challenge hung in the air between king and prince, a gauntlet thrown down before hundreds of witnesses. Darian's face remained impassive, though his eyes betrayed the rapid calculations taking place behind them. Lord Edgar, seeing his carefully maintained systems of influence threatened in real time, stepped to the edge of the balcony. His Majesty speaks from the kindness of his heart, he called out, attempting to reframe the king's words. In these difficult final hours, I speak with the authority of the crown, Alaric interrupted, his voice cutting through Edgar's smooth tones like a blade. An authority that has too long been surrendered to those who whisper of necessity while ensuring the continuation of their own privilege. The crowd roared its approval, the sound swelling until it seemed to shake the very stones of the castle. In that moment, watching the faces below transform with something like hope, Alaric understood what his reign might have been, what it should have been, if he had remembered that a king's true power lay not in the deference of nobles, but in the hearts of his people. The king's chambers had become a flurry of activity following his address to the people. Royal scribes hunched over parchment, recording his declarations in the precise language of legal decree. Guards stood at attention, their faces reflecting a new sense of purpose, no longer merely protecting a dying monarch, but safeguarding the embodiment of an unexpected legacy. Alaric sat at his great oak desk, his skeletal hand gripping a quill with surprising steadiness. The physicians had warned that any exertion might hasten his end, but a strange energy now animated his failing body, as if his renewed sense of purpose had temporarily suspended the progress of his illness. 3 copies, he instructed the chief scribe, his voice raspy but clear. 1 for the royal archives, 1 to be read publicly in every major town square throughout the kingdom, and 1, he glanced toward Eliza, who sat quietly by the fire with Thomas sleeping in her arms. 1 to remain with the children. Lord Edgar had retreated to convene an emergency meeting of the council, his face ashen with the realization that decades of carefully constructed influence were crumbling in the span of hours. Prince Darian remained, however, watching the proceedings with an expression that shifted between calculation and genuine bewilderment at his uncle's transformation. Uncle, he ventured, approaching the desk with careful deference. The people have dispersed peacefully, but the nobles are in an uproar. Lord Blackwell is threatening to withdraw his men from the northern garrison. Lady Hawthorne speaks of returning to her estates immediately. Let them posture, Alaric replied without looking up from his work. Their power has always depended on royal recognition. They will not sacrifice that so easily. The prince lowered his voice, casting a glance at the scribes laboring nearby. What you've begun today, it cannot be contained to just these 2 children. The common folk are already calling it a sign. They believe you've recognized their suffering. Perhaps I have, nephew. The king finally looked up, his eyes surprisingly clear despite the pallor of impending death that had settled over his features. Is that so terrible a legacy to leave you? Darian hesitated, caught between political instinct and something more fundamental, a question of what kind of ruler he truly aspired to be. It complicates things, he finally said. Ruling should be complicated, Alaric countered. The moment it becomes simple is the moment you've stopped seeing the full humanity of those you govern. A servant entered with a steaming pot of medicinal tea, a blend of herbs the physicians insisted might ease the king's pain, though they had abandoned any pretense that it might prolong his life. As the man poured a cup with practiced precision, his hands trembled slightly. Alaric noticed. "What troubles you?" he asked, surprising both the servant and Darian with his direct address to someone normally treated as invisible. The servant blinked, clearly unaccustomed to such personal attention from the monarch. "My sister, Your Majesty. She was in the crowd today. She has 5 children and struggles since her husband died in the flooding last spring." He swallowed hard. "She wept when you spoke of the children. She said perhaps things might finally change." Alaric closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of hope his words had inadvertently kindled. "What is your name?" "Thomas, sire." "Like the little one." The servant gestured toward the baby. "A good name," the king murmured. He reached for a blank piece of parchment and wrote quickly, his handwriting less formal than the scribe's careful calligraphy but no less authoritative. "See that your sister receives this. It grants her family a stipend from the royal treasury, effective immediately." The servant's eyes widened as he accepted the document with trembling fingers. "Your Majesty, I—" "Go," Alaric said gently, "before Lord Edgar returns and finds reasons why it cannot be done." After the servant departed, Darian stared at his uncle with undisguised astonishment. "You cannot personally address every hardship in the kingdom." "No," Alaric agreed, "but I can address the ones directly before me in the time I have left." He fixed his nephew with a penetrating gaze. "And I can hope that my successor might continue the practice." The challenge hung in the air between them, uncle and nephew, current king and future one. Before Darian could formulate a response, the door burst open without ceremony. Lord Edgar strode in, followed by 2 members of the royal guard whose uncomfortable expression suggested they were following orders they did not fully endorse. "Your Majesty," Edgar began, his tone a careful balance of deference and authority, "the council has convened an emergency session. In light of your declining health, we believe it prudent to begin the transition of authority immediately." Alaric raised an eyebrow. "The transition occurs upon my death, Lord Edgar, not a moment before." "Of course, sire." Edgar's smile didn't reach his eyes. "However, to ensure stability, certain documents require immediate attention, particularly in light of your recent declarations." The king understood immediately. The council sought to legally undermine his decree protecting Eliza and Thomas before it could be fully implemented. A day ago, such political maneuvering might have exhausted him into compliance. Now it merely strengthened his resolve. "My mind and authority remain intact," Alaric stated, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Any attempt to circumvent my directives before my passing will be recognized as treason against the crown." He turned to the guards who had accompanied Edgar. "Escort Lord Edgar from my chambers. He is relieved of his duties until further notice." The guards exchanged glances, then looked to Prince Darian, a telling indication of where they believed power already resided. The prince's decision in this moment would set the course for everything that followed. Darian straightened, seeming to grow taller as the weight of the choice before him settled on his shoulders. "You heard His Majesty," he said to the guards, his voice steady. "Escort Lord Edgar out." Color drained from Edgar's face as he realized his miscalculation. "Your Highness, consider carefully. The nobility's support is crucial for a peaceful succession." "So is honoring the final wishes of a beloved king," Darian replied, the words emerging with an authority that surprised even him. "I choose to do the latter." As the guards led a sputtering Edgar from the room, Alaric regarded his nephew with new eyes. Perhaps there was hope after all, not just for Eliza and Thomas, but for the kingdom itself. The king turned his attention back to the legal documents before him, his hand moving with increasing urgency across the parchment. Each word he committed to paper was another safeguard against the forces that would seek to undo his final act of conscience. The scribes worked silently alongside him, their quills scratching in unified purpose. Eliza approached the desk, Thomas still sleeping against her shoulder. She had watched the confrontation without comment, her eyes tracking each player with the wariness of a child who had learned early that adult conflicts often resulted in collateral damage to the innocent. "Will it work?" she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the growing stack of sealed documents. Alaric considered her question with the honesty she deserved. "I cannot promise what will happen after I'm gone. Power shifts. Alliances change." He glanced meaningfully at Prince Darian, who stood by the window in apparent contemplation. "But I can ensure that reversing my decree would come at a significant political cost." The king pulled a final document from beneath the others, different from the official decrees, written in his own hand rather than the formal script of the royal scribes. "This is for you," he told Eliza, "not to be opened until necessary." She accepted it solemnly, tucking it into the pocket of her new dress without question. Something in her expression suggested she understood this was not merely a legal document, but something more personal, a contingency the king had prepared should his public declarations prove insufficient. As the afternoon waned into evening, Alaric's strength began to fade with the light. The burst of energy that had sustained him through the public address and subsequent legal preparations ebbed away, leaving him gasping with each breath. The royal physician, summoned by a concerned servant, confirmed what everyone already knew. The king's final hours had arrived. "Have the documents been distributed?" Alaric asked, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Yes, Your Majesty," the chief scribe assured him. "Couriers have departed for every province. The royal seal has been affixed to all copies. It is done." A shadow of relief passed over the king's face. He motioned weakly for Eliza to approach his bedside, where he had been moved when sitting upright became too difficult. "Remember," he murmured as she leaned close, "you are under the protection of the crown now, not because of birthright or station, but because every child in this kingdom deserves such protection." His fingers tightened around hers with surprising strength. "Make them remember that." Tears filled Eliza's eyes, the first the king had seen from her despite all she had endured. One escaped, tracking a silvery path down her cheek. "I will," she promised. Prince Darian stepped forward, his expression solemn. "Uncle, the council requests permission to pay their respects." Alaric shook his head slightly. "No, my remaining time belongs to those who have had too little of it." He looked meaningfully at the children. "Let this be my final royal decree." As darkness fell over the kingdom, candles were lit in the king's chamber. Not the elaborate silver candelabras typically used for royal apartments, but simple beeswax tapers that cast a warm, golden light. Outside, in the town below the castle walls, something unprecedented was occurring. Ordinary citizens had begun placing candles in their windows, a silent vigil for a king they had rarely seen, but who, in his final act, had finally seen them. The castle bells tolled at dawn, their deep resonance carrying across the kingdom with solemn finality. King Alaric had passed quietly in the night, slipping away while Eliza dozed in a chair beside his bed, her small hand still clasped in his. It was the captain of the guard who discovered them, the dead king and the sleeping orphan, when he came to deliver the morning report. His weathered face softened at the sight, and he gently woke the girl with a hand on her shoulder. "He's gone, child," he said simply, his voice roughened by emotion he would have concealed in any other circumstance. Eliza didn't cry. She slowly withdrew her hand from the king's cooling grasp and stood, her back straight as a castle rampart. "I know," she replied, though how she knew remained unspoken. Perhaps something in the stillness of the room, or the particular quality of silence that surrounds a body abandoned by its spirit. He wasn't afraid. The captain nodded, understanding the girl's need to believe this. "I must inform the prince," he said, "and arrangements must be made. You should go to your brother." Thomas was awake in his makeshift cradle, unusually quiet, as if sensing the gravity that had settled over the chamber. Eliza lifted him into her arms, drawing comfort from his solid weight. and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Life continuing, despite everything. Within the hour, the castle transformed. Servants moved with hushed efficiency, royal mourning protocols enacted with practiced precision. Black fabric appeared as if by magic, draping over mirrors, replacing colorful banners with somber cloth. Prince Darian, now King Darian in all but official coronation, sequestered himself with the royal council, the door to the meeting chamber firmly closed against eavesdroppers. Eliza and Thomas remained in their small adjoining room, forgotten in the flurry of transition, or perhaps deliberately ignored. The servant assigned to bring their meals arrived with red-rimmed eyes, her movements mechanical as she arranged bread and cheese on the table. "What happens now?" Eliza asked, breaking the heavy silence. The servant hesitated, clearly uncertain how much to share with a child. "The king's body will lie in state for 3 days," she finally answered. "Then there will be a funeral procession through the city, followed by burial in the royal crypt. And us? What happens to us?" The woman's gaze slid away, unable to meet Eliza's direct stare. "I don't know, child. That's for the new king to decide." After the servant departed, Eliza retrieved the private document King Alaric had entrusted to her. The paper felt heavy in her small hands, the royal seal intact across its folded edge. "Not to be opened until necessary," he had said. Was now that time? She traced the seal with one finger, then carefully tucked the document back into her pocket. Not yet. First, she would see what path the new king chose. By midday, the castle grounds had filled with nobility arriving from country estates, their black-draped carriages forming a somber procession through the main gates. Common folk gathered too, standing in respectful silence beyond the walls, many still holding candles despite the daylight. The story of the king's final act, his public embrace of 2 orphaned children, had spread throughout the kingdom overnight, transforming a monarch long perceived as distant into something approaching beloved in his passing. Inside the great hall, King Alaric's body lay in state, dressed in full regalia. His crown, soon to rest on Darian's head, gleamed on a velvet cushion beside him. Noble families filed past in strict order of precedence, paying respects with formal phrases and carefully measured grief. Many cast curious glances around the hall, searching for the orphans who had featured so prominently in the king's final declaration. But Eliza and Thomas were not present. No one had come to escort them to the formal viewing, whether through oversight or deliberate exclusion. It was late afternoon when the door to their chamber finally opened without the customary knock. Lord Edgar entered, his tall frame seeming to fill the small room with shadow, despite the sunlight streaming through the window. His mourning clothes were immaculate, his expression a perfect mask of dignified sorrow. "The girl," he said, as if Eliza were not standing directly before him. "King Darian requests her presence." Eliza clutched Thomas closer to her chest. "My brother comes too." Edgar's mouth tightened into a thin line. "The king specified only you." "We stay together," Eliza insisted, her voice steady despite the fear fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird. "The decree said both of us." Something dangerous flashed in Edgar's eyes, the brief, unguarded revelation of a man unused to being challenged, particularly by a child. "Very well," he conceded after a moment, his tone suggesting that this minor victory would be short-lived. "Bring the infant." The corridor outside felt different now, colder, more hostile. Servants who had smiled at Eliza yesterday now averted their eyes as she passed. Guards stood straighter, their faces impassive. The very air seemed to have shifted with Alaric's final breath, reverting to the natural order that his momentary compassion had disrupted. They were led not to the throne room or the great hall, but to a small antechamber adjacent to the council room. King Darian waited inside, not yet wearing the crown, but already carrying himself with the distinctive posture of absolute authority. He stood by a narrow window, gazing out at the gathering crowds below. "Leave us," he instructed Edgar without turning. The counselor hesitated briefly, then bowed and withdrew, closing the door with a soft but definitive click. Silence stretched between them, the new king and the orphaned children who represented his uncle's unexpected final legacy. Eliza waited, having learned long ago that speaking first to those in power rarely ended well for those without it. My uncle was a practical man for most of his reign, Darian finally said, still looking out the window. It was only at the very end that he indulged in sentiment. Eliza said nothing, though her arms tightened protectively around Thomas. The decree he issued cannot be easily undone, the king continued, finally turning to face her. It bears the royal seal, witnessed by both nobility and commoners. To revoke it entirely would create complications I would prefer to avoid at the beginning of my reign. He studied her with cool assessment, as one might evaluate a piece on a chessboard, not inherently valuable but potentially useful, depending on its position. However, there are many ways to interpret a royal decree, many ways to fulfill its letter while perhaps adjusting its spirit. Fear prickled along Eliza's spine, but she forced herself to meet the king's gaze directly. He wanted us protected, she said simply. Yes, protected by the crown. A thin smile crossed Darian's face. But that protection could take many forms. A distant convent, perhaps, or a royal orphanage in the outer provinces, places where you would indeed receive shelter and education as promised, far from the castle and its sensitive matters. The king moved closer, lowering his voice though there was no one else to hear. I know what you claim to my uncle. These supposed documents, these secrets about the nobility. I should tell you that Lord Edgar has already conducted a thorough search of the Eastern Tower chamber. Nothing was found. Eliza's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered in her eyes, a reaction so brief that most would have missed it. Darian, trained from birth to read the subtle tells of courtiers and diplomats, did not. Interesting, he murmured. Perhaps the location my uncle mentioned wasn't entirely accurate. I never said where they were, Eliza replied, the words escaping before she could consider their wisdom. Darian's eyebrows rose slightly. No, you didn't. He circled her slowly, a predator assessing prey. Which raises the question of what else you might know, or claim to know. Thomas stirred in his sister's arms, making a small sound of discomfort. Eliza bounced him gently, an automatic gesture of comfort that seemed incongruously normal in the tense atmosphere of royal intrigue. I promised your brother protection, Darian said, watching this interaction with peculiar intensity. And I am a man of my word. The question is what form that protection should take. Eliza reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the sealed document. The moment had come sooner than expected. With steady hands that belied her age, she withdrew King Alaric's final message and held it out to Darian. He left this for me, she said, for this moment. The new king took the document with barely concealed surprise, examining the intact royal seal before breaking it with a practiced motion. His eyes moved rapidly across the parchment, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief to something approaching grudging respect. Clever, he finally said, refolding the document with deliberate care. My uncle was more strategic than I gave him credit for. He handed the parchment back to Eliza, an unexpected gesture that spoke volumes. It seems arrangements have already been made for your future here. Quite thorough arrangements, with contingencies I would find politically inconvenient to challenge. Relief flooded through Eliza, though she was careful not to let it show completely. Whatever King Alaric had written had achieved its purpose, creating a shield that even his ambitious nephew found too costly to dismantle. You will remain in the castle, Darian continued, his tone now briskly practical. Not in the royal quarters, but in suitable accommodations in the eastern wing. You will receive education appropriate to permanent wards of the crown, your brother likewise. He fixed her with a penetrating stare. In return, whatever information you possess, or believe you possess, remains private. Do we understand each other? Eliza nodded slowly. It wasn't the wholehearted protection King Alaric might have envisioned, but it was survival, something she had learned to recognize and accept in its many imperfect forms. Your Majesty. The door burst open, an agitated servant appearing with uncharacteristic disregard for protocol. Forgive the interruption, but you're needed urgently. The people. They're gathering at the gates. Thousands of them. They're asking to see the children. Darian's jaw tightened. To what purpose? They're calling it the king's promise. They say they want to ensure it's being honored. The servant swallowed nervously. They're carrying candles, sire, like a vigil. The new king turned back to the window, gazing down at the swelling crowd with an expression that mingled annoyance and calculation. After a long moment, he looked back at Eliza, seeing her with new eyes, not merely as an inconvenient obligation inherited from his uncle, but as a symbol that had taken on a life of its own. It seems my uncle's last act has created something unexpected, he said quietly. Something that cannot be locked away in a distant convent or royal orphanage without consequence. Eliza stood straighter, Thomas secure in her arms, feeling a strange shift in the balance of power between them. King Alaric's protection extended beyond legal documents and royal decrees. It lived now in the collective memory of his people, a promise they had claimed as their own. You'll need to appear with me, Darian said, making his decision with the pragmatism that defined his approach to rule. The people must see that you remain under the crown's protection, as my uncle wished. As they moved toward the great hall where the formal announcement would be made, Eliza paused to look back at the small chamber where King Alaric's body lay in state. Though she couldn't see him from this distance, she whispered words meant only for him. You kept your promise, in a way no one expected. And somewhere, in whatever realm follows this one, perhaps the king heard her. Sometimes our greatest legacy isn't built over decades, but in our final moments when we find the courage to stand for what truly matters. King Alaric's story reminds us that redemption doesn't require time, it requires choice. In his last 3 days, he accomplished what 40 years on the throne could not. He became truly royal not through birth or crown, but through compassion. What would you do if you knew your time was limited? Would you cling to comfortable patterns? Or would you find the strength to challenge the very systems you helped create? It's never too late to make a choice that echoes beyond your lifetime. Like ripples in still water, a single act of genuine humanity can transform not just one life, but an entire kingdom. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that change is possible even in our final moments. Subscribe to see more stories that challenge us to look beyond ourselves and recognize the power we all hold to make a difference, no matter how much time we have left. Remember, true nobility isn't in the titles we carry, but in the promises we keep when keeping them costs us everything.